Hello and welcome to ProfDale's Property Videos number 3. I'm Dale Whitman. In this video, we're going to look at some conditions that might exist on the property that could potentially inhibit or even prevent adverse possession from arising. So what are the conditions that might inhibit or prevent adverse possession from arising on a parcel of land? Well, there are traditionally 5 of them, and we're going to list them on this slide, but don't worry about memorizing them now because we're going to look at each one individually. The first is that someone holds a future interest in the property. Second, if there's been a mortgage that's been imposed on the property, usually because the present true owner or some previous owner borrowed some money. Number 3, the land's divided into surface estates and mineral estate. There are 2 different estates in the same land. Number 4, the true owner is under a legal disability. And number 5, the true owner is the government. Now we're going to take a look at each one of these situations and see how they work. The first condition we want to talk about is a situation in which someone holds a future interest in the property. What do we mean by a future interest? We mean that someone will have the right of possession of the land in the future, but has no right of possession at the present time. Let's take an example. Suppose that the true owner at some time in the past has made a deed to A for life and then to B. Well, the property has been divided into 2 different estates now. A has a life estate, meaning that A has the right of present possession as long as A lives, and B has a future interest, meaning that B will get possession of the land, but only when A dies. Now, after the property has been split into a life estate and a future interest in this manner, an adverse possessor moves onto the land, and the adverse possessor remains there for the full time period with all the right behaviors. At the end of the time period, what does the adverse possessor own? And the answer is just A's life estate. The adverse possessor doesn't get B's future interest. What's the reason for that? Well, the reason has to do with the nature of an action in ejectment. Only someone who has the right of possession can bring a suit in ejectment. And since B doesn't have a right of possession yet, B couldn't sue the adverse possessor. Therefore, no statute of limitations is running against B, and B doesn't get title to the future interest when the adverse possession period is over. Now, is there a way that the adverse possessor could get title to the future interest? Well, there is, but something more has to happen. What has to happen is that first A has to die so that the life estate is over and B's future interest becomes possessory. In other words, B is now entitled to possession. Then the adverse possessor has to remain on the property for another full adverse possession period against B, and at the end of that period, the adverse possessor will now own not only A's life estate, but B's future interest as well, and therefore will hold a fee simple absolute title to the land. The second condition we want to talk about is that in which someone holds a mortgage on the property. So we're going to talk about the adverse possessor versus the mortgagee. The true owner, let's suppose, borrows some money from a bank and imposes a mortgage on the property to the bank to secure repayment of the loan. After that happens, then an adverse possessor moves on the land, stays there for the required time period with all the right behaviors. When does the statute of limitations begin to run against the bank? Well, this is much like the situation of the future interest that we talked about a few minutes ago. A bank that holds a mortgage on the property in most states doesn't have the right of present possession of the property, and therefore no statute of limitations is running against the bank as long as all the bank has is simply a mortgage against the property. So when does a bank become entitled to possession so that the statute of limitations would begin running against the bank? Well, the answer is that the bank only becomes entitled to possession when the bank can foreclose the mortgage, and foreclosure can occur only when the loan goes into default. Now, will the loan go into default? Well, we don't know. It depends. Either the true owner or the adverse possessor might make the payments on the loan and prevent default. But if neither one of them does so, then the loan will go into default, the bank can foreclose, and as soon as the bank forecloses, the bank's entitled to possession, and at that point, if the adverse possessor remains on the land for 10 more years, the adverse possessor will own the property free and clear of the mortgage. Prior to that happening, however, the adverse possessor will own the land after staying for the adverse possession period, but will hold it with the mortgage still remaining in effect on the property. The third condition we want to talk about is one in which the surface estate and the mineral estates have been severed or, in effect, taken apart from one another. To illustrate, let's take a case in which there's a parcel of land with a little house on the surface, and below the surface there's a pool of oil or gas. Now, ordinarily, whoever owns the house will own the oil and gas as well, because traditionally, a real estate owner owns everything down to the center of the earth and up to the sky. However, let's assume that the true owner of the house decides to enter into an oil and gas deed or lease. It doesn't really matter which one it is. What it says is that the true owner conveys to A all of the oil, gas, and other minerals under the surface of this land. Now the property has been split into two different estates, the surface estate and the mineral estate where the oil lies. And each of them is treated as a separate parcel of land. Now let's suppose an adverse possessor moves into the house on the surface, stays there for the required time period. What does the adverse possessor own? Well, the answer is only the surface estate. Why? Because the adverse possessor hasn't done any trespassory actions against the mineral estate. Now, what does the adverse possessor have to do in order to gain title to the oil and gas? Well, the answer is the adverse possessor's got to do something illegal to the mineral estate. The typical way of doing this would be to drill an oil well and begin sucking the oil out of the ground. You don't necessarily have to go that far as an adverse possessor. You might succeed in your trespassory action simply by taking core samples or otherwise exploring for oil on the property. But the point is that the adverse possessor has got to do something illegal to the mineral estate and has got to continue doing that for the full adverse possession period in order to get title to the minerals. The fourth condition we want to talk about is one in which the owner is under a legal disability. Now, this is a rather astounding fact, but an owner who's under a disability doesn't have to worry about adverse possessors on the land. They simply can't get title. When we talk about disabilities here, we're talking of legal disabilities. Don't confuse them with physical or mental disabilities. There's no connection between the two necessarily. Now, what are the legal disabilities? Traditionally, there are 3 of them, and I'm going to list them here, and then I'll give you a quick way of remembering them. The 3 are infancy, being under the age of 18, insanity, being crazy, whether you're adjudicated as such or not, and imprisonment. Now, you can easily remember these 3 because they all start with the letter I. So just think of the 3 I's for disability: infancy, insanity, and imprisonment. If a person is under any or all of those disabilities, an adverse possessor cannot get their title away from them. Some states impose some time limits on how long the disability may last and continue to be immune from adverse possession. For example, they might say you're immune if you're imprisoned, but not for more than 20 years. Some of the other states impose time limits for the true owner to act after the disability is removed. They say, for example, after you get out of jail, you've got to bring a suit against the adverse possessor within 5 years or something of that sort. Some of the states also add other disabilities, such as residing out of the state or being a citizen of a country that's at war with the United States. But those are rather odd and don't come up very often. The three you need to remember are infancy, insanity, and imprisonment. Now, what are the principles involved in having a disability and having an adverse possessor move on your property? The first principle is we only count disabilities that existed when the adverse possession began. It doesn't make any difference if somebody goes crazy or gets thrown in jail after an adverse possessor has moved on their property. That will have no effect on the adverse possessor at all. Only disabilities that were already in effect when the adverse possession commenced. However, all the disabilities that existed on that date, that is the date the adverse possession commenced, have to be removed in order for the adverse possession period to begin running. So let's assume that the true owner is a 16-year-old who is also insane and is in jail, and an adverse possessor moves onto the kid's land. Obviously, no statute of limitations in adverse possession will begin to run because this true owner is under 3 different disabilities. So let's assume that he turns 18. Does the statute begin to run? No, because he's still crazy and still in jail. At age 20, the prison psychiatrist cures his mental illness, but once again, he's still in jail, so the statute still won't start to run. Finally, at age 22, he's released from prison, and then, and only then, does the adverse possession period begin to run. And of course, it has to run for the full time. So all of the disabilities that existed at the time the adverse possession began, all of them must be removed in order for the adverse possession period to begin running. Now, there's a basic principle that runs through all of the examples that we've looked at to date, and that principle is that nothing the true owner does with the title after the adverse possessor moves onto the land will have any effect on the adverse possessor. For example, splitting it into present and future interests after the adverse possessor has moved onto the land has no effect on the adverse possessor. Putting a mortgage on it after the adverse possessor has moved on will have no effect on the adverse possessor. Splitting it into surface and mineral estates, that won't affect the adverse possessor either, and the adverse possessor will get both the surface and mineral estates. Finally, becoming subject to a legal disability, as we've already pointed out, has no effect on the adverse possessor if it happens after the adverse possessor has moved onto the land. The final condition we want to talk about is where the owner is a governmental entity. The point of this is that the government at all levels is immune to adverse possession. This means federal, state, county, city, any level of government is not affected by having an adverse possessor move onto the land. Now, some states do make an exception if the government is using the property in a proprietary capacity. In other words, they're using it to operate a business. A typical example is, for example, an irrigation district. The purpose, it's a government entity, but its purpose is to supply water to local farmers, and they pay for it, of course. And therefore, a court might say, and for example, one court did say, that that property was being used in a proprietary capacity, and therefore an adverse possessor could obtain title to it against the government. But that's quite unusual. Now, 2 other situations which some states say are immune from adverse possession, and those are nonprofits, churches, and or utility companies. The reasoning seems to be that for a nonprofit, it's just a shame for it to lose its title to an adverse possessor, and utility companies have so much real estate that they have, for example, power lines, pipelines, sewer, water lines. They have so much property that they can't really be expected to watch it and determine whether an adverse possessor is on it or not. So there are some states, not all, that say that nonprofits, churches, and utilities are immune from the claim of adverse possession. That concludes video number 3. If you have questions or comments, email ProfDale01@gmail.com. In video number 4, we'll wind up adverse possession by covering the concept of tacking and by taking a brief look at adverse possession of personal property.